Hi folks, hope you're okay. We're looking at this book, The Portrait of Jesus, and we're in chapter 1. We're looking at the Gospels. What we learn about the life of Jesus in the Bible we learn from the 4 Gospels. Although the idea that Jesus is a Saviour and Lord is present on every page of the rest of the New Testament, it's only in the 4 Gospels that we get any details. Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, has a strong Jewish flavour and contains many references to Jewish beliefs and practices. A key theme in Matthew's Gospel is how Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. Jesus is shown as being the son of David and the Messiah, the long-promised king. Jesus also is a great teacher in the line of Moses, who teaches and explains the new law, the Torah, to his followers. Matthew also shows how, through Jesus, God's plan for the whole world will be fulfilled. In Mark, the shorter of the Gospels, Jesus is portrayed as the Son of God, a dynamic authoritative figure who is constantly on the move. Mark says a lot about Jesus' action, his power over the nature and supernatural world in his death. Luke's Gospel is unique in that it has a sequel, the book of Acts, and is therefore part of a 2-volume work. Luke emphasizes Jesus as the Saviour, rescuer sent by God. Luke has a particular interest in those we would today call the marginalized women, children, the poor, those rejected of society. John, the 4th Gospel, is different in style. In John's Gospel, Jesus is presented as the one who by his words and actions reveals who God is. 7 great statements in which he says, I am, highlight the claims of Jesus. In these he claims to be the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the gate, I am the good shepherd, etc., the resurrection and life, the way, the truth and the life. Although some skeptical scholars have considered that John's Gospel is a less reliable source of information on Jesus than the Synoptics, there is no evidence for this. John's sequence of events makes sense, and his knowledge of the landscape of Palestine is accurate. Frequently, too, there are details in John such as who ran faster to the tomb on the first Easter morning, and the number of fish caught that seem to be eyewitness touches. Who wrote the Gospels? Early church tradition considered Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples, to be the author of the first Gospel. Mark and Luke, 2 men who were involved in the church in its very first years, to have authored the 2nd and the 3rd Gospels. John, another disciple, was believed to be have written the 4th Gospel. There seems no reason why these traditions shouldn't be correct. The case, 2 authors were eyewitnesses to the events they describe, while the others must have used source eyewitness accounts, traditions and other records. Next, where were the Gospels written? Archaeological evidence suggests that John's Gospel was in circulation soon after 100 AD. In fact, most scholars believe that all the Gospels were written earlier, and there is evidence for all the Synoptic Gospels being written before AD 65. So, for instance, Acts, the 2nd of Luke's 2 volumes, ends with 8 chapters on the legal proceedings to do with Paul, concluding on the final page, which Paul's awaiting trial in AD 60 to 64. For a skilled author like Luke, such a cliffhanger of an ending is odd. The most obvious explanation is that this was when Luke was writing and Paul's trial still lay in the future. In fact, Luke and Acts might be part of the defense brief of Paul's appeal. As well as the 4 Gospels, the New Testament also contains the book of Acts and letters and Revelation. What we learn in Acts is how the very first Christians understood Jesus. This comes over most clearly in the summaries of what the apostles taught about Jesus. The letters are important as evidence about Jesus, not so much because they tell us a lot about his life, but because most of them are earlier than the Gospels. So, for instance, it is generally agreed that the letter to the Galatians and Thessalonians were written in AD 48 to 51, within 20 years of the crucifixion. It's interesting, a lot of skeptics, atheists and critical skeptics will say you're using the Bible to prove the Bible. What they don't understand, or what they don't want you to understand, is the Gospels and the Paul's epistles, irrespective of whether you believe the Bible or not, are ancient historical material, and they are very early historical material in terms of the events that happened prior to them writing those pieces of material. So they're very important for historical inquiry. So whether you're a Bible believer or not, it's silly to say, oh, when you're using Galatians or using Thessalonians, you're trying to use the Bible. No, we're just using historical material. There's a difference. Jesus outside the New Testament. Not long after defenders of Christianity used to make a great deal about the evidence of Jesus from outside the Bible. The reason for this was that there were people who denied that historical Jesus had ever existed and who believed he was totally mythical or legendary. Against this argument, the evidence from such writers as Tacitus and Josephus was valuable. But the debate has moved on, and now it is very rare to meet anyone who's done any serious study on the subject who is prepared to say that Jesus never lived. Although skeptical scholars may consider Jesus no more than a purely human preacher, they do recognize his existence. Indeed, it is surprising how much historical accuracy scholars are now prepared to credit to the Gospels. For instance, in 2001, the BBC showed a major documentary series entitled Son of God, which listed over 20 academic consultants, many of whom were not Christians. A number were Jewish. What surprised many people was the sheer amount of the Gospel accounts that they were prepared to treat as historical facts. So there are authors in his life. Jesus was a insignificant character in a major province of the Roman Empire, so it's not surprising that there is little in the historical record about him. In fact, documentation on most figures of the time is poor. For instance, outside the Gospel account, what we know about Pontius Pilate, the governor of the province of Judea for 11 years, would fit on the back of a postcard. Works have survived from various Roman authors that mention in passing the spread of the Jesus cult in the 1st century, but they tell us little that we do not know from the letters of the New Testament. There were apparently Christians in Rome by the mid-40s, and riots among the Jews over the preaching of Jesus as the Christ in AD 49, Tacitus writing around AD 115 about the fire of Rome 50 years earlier says this about Christians: the founder of this sect, Christus, was given the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by the pure creator Pontius Pilate. Suppressed for the moment, the detestable superstition broke out again only in Judea, where the evil originated, but also in the city of Rome, to which everything horrible and shameful flow, and where it grows. Now it's interesting that the Tacitus text, Tacitus is known for being a good historian. Especially on religious topics, he would make sure he go and checked and verified his information. Skeptics will try and knock down Tacitus and say, you know, he's not reliable, but that's not true. He's a very good historian, and the skeptics will do everything to undermine any piece of evidence that will come their way, which will show the existence and verify the Christian faith, the existence of Jesus, and verify the Christian faith. Next, at about the same time, Pliny the Younger wrote from what is now Turkey to the Emperor Trajan for a ruling on whether to execute these Christians who worship Christ as God. Also, we have the Jewish writer who was influenced by Rome AD 37-100, whose books are vital source for events in 1st century Palestine. Josephus fought against the Romans in the Jewish revolt of AD 60-70. Before switching sides and ended up under Rome as an expert on Jewish affairs. In one of his books, The Antiquities of the Jews, written around AD 95, Josephus refers to Jesus. Now there was about this time Jesus a wild man, if by the lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of surprising works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again on the 3rd day, as the divine prophets have foretold these, and 10,000 of the wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of the Christians so named for him are not extinct to this day. Although the authenticity of this passage has been challenged, most scholars now believe that the main parts, at least, are genuine. That is correct, that is fair. You'll find atheist scholars like Dr. Richard Carrier say no scholars believe that the Josephus text is right. That or every scholar believes that Josephus text has been interpolated, changed by a Christian writer in 400 AD. But that's not true. That's just a complete and utter lie that Richard Carrier is telling you. The fact of the matter is that most scholars believe there's been a little interpolation, but the vast majority, the bulk of what Josephus says about Jesus is true Josephus. So that means you've got solid historical evidence of the existence of Jesus. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, a collection of ancient manuscripts was found in a series of caves in the area west of the Dead Sea, and the scene since been slowly translated and published. Despite periodic claims to the contrary, the scrolls make no mention of Jesus and appear to have been largely written before his ministry began. The scrolls are rather useful in that they give an insight into the Jewish mindset of the times. Before the discovery of the scrolls, much of our knowledge of Judaism came considerably later sources. It was not always clear how Jesus and his followers related to the Jewish faith. The Dead Sea Scrolls have shown us that the Jewish faith in the early 1st century was much more varied than had been assumed, and many of Jesus' views and sayings now fit much better into the Jewish world of his time. So in other words, as we've looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's actually verified the gospel picture of Jesus. Alright, even though there's nothing in those scrolls about Jesus, there is a lot about the culture of Jesus, and that verifies Jesus. Okay. The apocryphal books of the New Testament. In recent years there has been much interest in what I call the apocryphal books of the New Testament. The apocryphal books are those documents that circulated within the early church but were excluded when the formal list of approved books of the New Testament was drawn up. These apocryphal books include stories, letters, teachings. For the last 100 years or so, some scholars have looked again at these documents in the hope that they'll yield more information about Jesus than we have in existing Gospels. Yet no one has made a convincing case for any of these adding anything significant to what the existing 4 Gospels say. The answer, so where does this leave us? The answer is that we are much where we always were. We have the hard data from the 4 Gospels and little else. From Josephus, Tacitus, and others we glimpse a faint silhouette of Jesus, but only in the Gospels do we have anything like a full picture of who Jesus was and what he said and did. Yet the limited data that we have is important. The skeptical opinion of treating Jesus as a myth has vanished. To hold such a view always required an extraordinary faith that somehow people could make up the whole thing. And equally, these facts have removed the skeptic's opinion to dismiss Jesus entirely. They also limit the freedom of those New Age sympathies to reinvent Jesus in a way that fits better with their own views. The Jesus of the Bible firmly belongs to a time and place. He is a Jew of early 1st century Palestine, and our views of who he was and is have to take this into account. This is serious and very, very important. It's no good as a New Ager or a postmodernist or a skeptic and say, well, I think Jesus this and I think Jesus that. We look at the historical context of 1st century Judaism and we find that the Gospels fit nicely into that and reflect that culture, and that's where we're at. Alright?